Hey y'all, welcome back to Sentro School. Today's video is about how to knit a panel on the Sentro, plus we'll go over a few tips on how to address some common problems you might encounter when knitting a panel. So let's get started. First, let's cast on. If you don't already know how to cast on, then be sure to check out my tutorial. It should pop up on the screen over here, but I'll also be sure to link it in the description. It's really easy, but if you'd like some more in-depth information, then be sure to check that video out. For now, I'll just give a quick demonstration. So just put a tail into the machine like this. Go to your third needle and then wrap your yarn around this needle like this, then crank your handle and bring the yarn behind, in front, behind, in front, until you've cast on however many stitches you need. So I'm just going to cast on 15 stitches here. Then put your yarn through the yarn and tension guides. And then we're going to crank our handle just a little bit more this way so that this yarn gets under this ridge here. Then we can start turning our handle the opposite direction. And as we're doing that, we're going to pull on our yarn here with our left hand. Just pull sort of gently on it so that it stays taut as we're turning back. Later we'll get into why we need to pull this yarn when we're starting a new row, but for now let's just keep knitting. So just crank your handle slowly until you get to the end of your row. And again, we want to make sure that this yarn is getting caught under this ridge here, the ridge after our last needle. And then you're just going to repeat that until you have however many rows that you need. So we're going back and forth, and when we start a new row, we are pulling on our yarn just a little bit to keep this taut. Then you'll cast off. Again, I have a tutorial for how to cast off, so if you'd like a more in-depth demonstration of that, then go ahead and watch that. The link will be in the description, but for now we'll just do a quick little explanation. So take your yarn out of the yarn and tension guides, and you're going to hold it away from the needles so that it won't knit it back into the project, and just release all of the stitches from the machine. Then thread your yarn through a darning needle and pick up all of the stitches in order. Once you've picked up every stitch and it's off the machine, you can go ahead and give your project a stretch. And you've got a panel. Now time for some tips on knitting panels. First, we can talk about why we need to pull the yarn when starting a new row. We want to make sure the stitches on the sides of our panels aren't too loose. If they are too loose, you'll run the risk of dropping those stitches. The most common problem I hear from people using the Sentro is that their side stitches always want to drop. That's why so many people have trouble knitting panels but not tubes, because there are no side stitches in a tube, but there are in a panel. Tightening your side stitches by gently pulling on the yarn as you start a new row is probably going to fix that problem 99% of the time. If you're knitting a panel and you're still struggling with the side stitches even after tightening your yarn on the edges as you knit, then you can try adding weights to your project. I use clothespins as my weights, but you can kind of use whatever you want. So you're just going to clip them on to your project like this, sort of evenly spaced, just like that. And the weight of these clothespins pulling down on your project should also help decrease the chances of getting drop stitches, not only on the side stitches here, but also all along your project. So then after you knit a few rows, let's say these are getting close to the table here, then you'll just pick the stitches up or pick the clothespins up and then just move them up your project. So again, it will just help keep pulling down on your project. It helps keep the stitches from wanting to pop up on your needles, just pulls them down so that they're less likely to pop off of your needle and create a tucked or a drop stitch. If after all that your project is still dropping stitches on the sides, then it's probably a yarn issue. There's not much you can do about that other than use different yarn or take it slow when you're knitting on the Sentro with that troublesome yarn. Even with yarn that works super well on the Sentro, if you're knitting really fast, it's just going to be more likely that you'll drop or tuck stitches. When I'm knitting with yarn that works super well on the Sentro, like this yarn, this is about how fast I knit in real time. It's fast, but it gives me plenty of time to catch any stitches that may be acting up so I can fix them before they drop or tuck. I know it can be tempting to rush through knitting your project. After all, most people probably get a Sentro because of its speed, but if you have to constantly fix stitches or frog and reknit your entire project, it's not going to end up being very quick or efficient. But you know, mistakes happen, so if you do happen to mess up and you accidentally tuck or drop a stitch, then I do have some shorts on how to fix those tucked and dropped stitches, so check those out so you don't have to just start your project over from the beginning. I'll also be releasing some more in-depth videos about fixing tucked and dropped stitches soon, so be on the lookout for those as well. And for the last tip, I wanted to talk about knitting a panel in the tube setting. I usually like to knit my panels in the panel setting because I find it helpful to have my machine stop me from continuing to knit on at least one side, since I often kind of space out while knitting or I start thinking about other things and I'm just not paying super close attention to my project. It's nice to have that crutch so I don't keep knitting past this edge of my project by accident, but you do not have to knit your panel in the panel setting. You can knit it in the tube setting, which can have a couple different benefits. First, you can cast on the first needle rather than the third. Like I talk about in my video on how to cast on and off of your Sentro, you cannot cast on to these 3 pins right here, the final pin and the first 2 pins in the panel setting, because your machine can't turn far enough in either direction to knit those 3 stitches. That means in the panel setting, the first needle that you can cast onto is the 3rd needle. You don't have to cast on to the 3rd needle, you can cast on to any of them except for these 3, of course, but the 3rd needle is the first that you can cast onto in the panel setting. In the tube setting though, you don't have to worry about that at all. You can just start casting on to any needle you want. This is of course helpful because it's just easier to start counting from 1 rather than 3. It seems pretty simple, but once you start manipulating your project more, it can be super helpful to know that your project starts on needle number 1. It just makes things a lot easier. Second, you can easily switch from knitting back and forth on your panel to knitting in the round. This can be helpful for a variety of projects, but a common one would be if you want to knit a panel for a top and then start knitting an I-cord as a strap. You can, of course, knit your panel in the panel setting and then switch it over to the tube setting once you're ready, but if you just start on the tube setting from the beginning, it's just one less thing you have to think about when making your project. So that's all I have for y'all today. If you have any other tips for knitting panels, be sure to leave them in the comments. I'm sure we'd all appreciate that very much. And if you have any questions related to the Sentro, then please leave those in the comments below as well. Be sure to like this video if you found it helpful and consider subscribing if you enjoy Sentro content. This is just one video of many in my Sentro instructional video series, so be sure to keep an eye out for more. I hope y'all have a great rest of your day and I'll see you next time. Bye!